Imagine a creation so profitable, it needs no factory, no raw material, not even a shape. Something people buy every single day without seeing it, touch it, or question it. That invisible creation is debt. For centuries, it has powered wars, crowned empires, and hollowed out nations. Yet ask anyone where debt began, who built it, and why it rules our lives, and you'll meet silence. Debt is not a footnote in economic history. It is economic history, the quiet current that moves money and power. At its core, debt is a promise. You borrow today and repay tomorrow. Simple. But hidden in that exchange lies a mechanism that reshapes civilization. Interest. The moment someone charges for time, the future itself becomes a commodity. Long before paper money or banks, the people of ancient Mesopotamia carved debts into clay tablets. Grain owed, silver owed. But every few decades, their kings wiped those tablets clean. These debt jubilees weren't acts of kindness, they were acts of survival. When too many citizens were crushed by obligation, the system collapsed. Freedom had to be restored, or the empire would rot from within. The Hebrew Bible echoes that wisdom. Every 50 years, it commands the forgiveness of debts. The message was clear. Credit could build a community, but unchecked, it could enslave one. Yet over time, that caution faded. As civilizations grew, powerful elites learned that debt need not be erased. It could be weaponized. In medieval Europe, the church condemned usury, the charging of excessive interest. On parchment, it looked righteous. In practice, merchants and bankers simply learned to hide it. A loan became a trade agreement. Interest disguised itself as fees, and through these quiet loopholes, the moneylenders of Venice, Genoa, and Florence turned moral sin into everyday business. By the dawn of the Renaissance, a new kind of empire was rising, not of land or swords, but of ledgers. Families like the Medici transformed the flow of credit into dynastic power. They financed popes and princes, wars and cathedrals. Their coins bore their crest, their letters shaped policy. They had discovered a deeper kind of conquest, the control of obligation. Debt was evolving from contract to engine, an invisible force driving everything that moved. Then came a transformation so vast it would redefine the modern world, the birth of public debt. In the late 16th century, the Dutch Republic broke free from Spain. To fund its rebellion, it sold pieces of its promise to its own citizens. Bonds, they called them, slips of paper representing faith in the state. Anyone could lend to the government, collect interest, and even sell that promise to someone else. For the first time, war was no longer bound by the gold in a king's vault. It could be financed indefinitely by selling the future itself. The Dutch perfected the model, and soon England followed. In the year 1694, the Bank of England was born, a central institution that would lend to the crown, issue notes, and manage a permanent national debt. The arrangement was elegant and revolutionary. The government promised payment, the bank printed the promise, and citizens accepted it as money. Debt was no longer a temporary measure for emergencies. It had become the bloodstream of the state. The profits were staggering. Lending to kings was safer than lending to anyone else. Kings could always tax their subjects to repay. Wars that once bankrupted monarchs could now be fought endlessly. The empire fed the banks fed the empire. The more nations fought, the more they borrowed. The more they borrowed, the richer their creditors became. It was a perfect circle, spinning faster with every generation. By the 18th century, the bond markets of London, Paris, and Amsterdam were pulsed like living organs of global finance. Soldiers marched, ships sailed, colonies fell, all on borrowed money. Paper promises fueled steel and gunpowder, but the web of credit was spreading beyond palaces and parliaments. As industrial capitalism took shape, ordinary lives were drawn into its rhythm. Railroads, mines, and factories rose from the ground, each financed by bonds and loans. Investors bought shares of projects they would never see. Workers earned wages from companies built on borrowed capital. And soon they themselves began to borrow. For homes, tools, and later for comfort. Debt seeped quietly into the soil of everyday life. By the early 19th century, credit had become civilization's nervous system. It linked farmers to merchants, governments to bankers, laborers to landlords. Every payment fed another promise. Every promise fed another payment. A single truth guided it all. Debt made time liquid. It allowed you to live tomorrow's prosperity today, at a price. And that price was never neutral. Every coin of interest was a transfer of power from debtor to creditor, from the many to the few. The brilliance, or the cruelty of the system, was its repetition. A product sold once brings profit once, but a debt brings profit again and again, month after month, year after year. A house purchased on credit could cost twice its value. A small delay in payment could double the interest owed. What began as a promise slowly hardened into a trap, yet few saw it that way. For merchants, debt financed trade. For governments, it sustained empire. For workers, it offered the dream of progress. Borrowing became synonymous with growth, proof that the future would be richer than the present. Debt had achieved what no product in history had managed. It made dependence feel like freedom. The great financiers of Amsterdam, London, and Paris understood this perfectly. They no longer merely managed debt, they manufactured it. Each new war, each new railway, each new invention became another opportunity to lend, to collect, to expand. The ledger had replaced the sword, and behind every empire's triumph stood a line of creditors counting interest, quietly shaping the fate of nations. By the close of the 19th century, the world's economic map glowed with their influence. Colonies were mortgaged to pay for conquest. Industries were born in debt and died in it. The balance of power no longer lay entirely in armies or resources, but in the ability to borrow, and to make others borrow. Debt had graduated from a financial instrument to a philosophy. It whispered that growth could be infinite, that the future was an inexhaustible mine of wealth waiting to be extracted. But every mine, no matter how deep, eventually hits rock. And when it did, the cost would not fall on the lenders. It would fall on the borrowers, on the millions whose lives had been built upon invisible promises. By the early 20th century, debt was no longer the province of kings or captains of trade. It had seeped into kitchens, factories, and pay envelopes. Borrowing had become a way of life. The banker's ledger was now everyone's diary. Mortgages and installment plans turned aspiration into obligation. Owning a home was a sign of independence, meant signing a contract that bound an entire generation to 3 decades of payments. Credit no longer carried the scent of shame. It smelled like progress. After the Second World War, nations rebuilt themselves on borrowed money. The architects of Bretton Woods, meeting in 1944, promised stability, but delivered something else, a machine that institutionalized debt. The new institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, offered lifelines that came with invisible hooks. Nations could borrow for growth, but only on terms written by their creditors. Behind the polished language of development hid a simple rule: obedience in exchange for liquidity. Countries that failed to comply faced the slow suffocation of withheld funds. In the name of modernization, entire economies were redesigned from afar. Debt had become diplomacy by other means. At home, a quieter revolution unfolded. Banks discovered that the most profitable customers were not governments, but households. A family with a steady paycheck was the perfect debtor. Reliable, predictable, endlessly renewable. The mortgage became the crown jewel of middle-class identity. Car loans, furniture credit, and finally the small plastic rectangle called the credit card turned debt into a lifestyle accessory. Buy now, pay later, whispered the billboards. It sounded like freedom, but it was dependence dressed as choice. For corporations and politicians, this new faith in credit was a miracle. It kept factories busy, voters happy, and balance sheets rising. Even when wages stagnated, consumption could continue, funded by the promise of tomorrow. Debt had become the hidden engine of capitalism, quietly spinning beneath the noise of productivity. But engines built on pressure must one day release steam. By the 1970s, governments had learned that borrowing was easier than taxing. Banks had learned that lending was safer than waiting. And central banks had learned that printing money was simpler than saying no. The result was a global addiction disguised as prosperity. When the oil shocks hit, Western banks found themselves awash with petrodollars, vast oceans of money searching for return. They poured it into the developing world. Countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia borrowed at record pace, convinced that progress could be purchased on credit. Then the music changed. In the early 1980s, interest rates soared under the Federal Reserve's new policy. What had been manageable became impossible. Mexico defaulted in 1982, and the dominoes began to fall. The solution, ironically, was more debt, refinanced, rescheduled, rebranded as structural adjustment. Nations sold their state companies, cut their public services, and opened their markets, all to keep the interest flowing upward. The burden was not abstract. It lived in rising food prices, empty hospitals, and shuttered schools. For the many, austerity. For the few, stability. Debt had become the silent weapon of empire. Meanwhile, in the wealthy world, the financial industry was discovering a new kind of alchemy. No longer content to profit from interest alone, bankers learned to sell debt itself. Mortgages, car loans, and corporate IOUs were bundled into packages, sliced into tranches, and traded like precious metals. What had once been a personal promise became a global commodity. This was the era of financialization, the moment credit became the raw material of the modern age. A bank could issue a loan, sell it to investors, and move on, collecting fees at every stage. Risk was said to be spread. In truth, it was hidden, waiting. When it finally surfaced in 2008, the illusion shattered. The housing market collapsed, and the towers of leverage crumbled. Millions lost homes, jobs, and savings. Yet the very institutions that engineered the disaster were rescued first. Governments printed trillions to save the creditors, proving once more who the system was built to serve. Debt, instead of shrinking, exploded. Zero interest rates and central bank stimulus made borrowing cheaper than ever. The cure was the same as the disease: more credit, more liquidity, more promises. The addiction deepened. Today, global debt surpasses $300 trillion, 3 times the planet's annual output. Never before has humanity owed so much to so few. Politicians call it growth. Economists chart it as progress. But most of it is merely tomorrow's income spent today. A student signs a contract for education and begins adulthood in chains. A family buys a house and spends a lifetime paying twice its price. A nation runs a deficit and calls it investment. The numbers rise, the freedom falls. Inflation, that quiet thief, becomes the system's accomplice. It erodes wages, devalues savings, and makes repayment possible only by making money itself worth less. Prosperity turns out to be leverage wearing a friendly smile. Every month, every payment, wealth flows upward, from millions of debtors to a narrow peak of creditors. Those with assets borrow cheaply to multiply their wealth. Those without pay dearly to survive. Debt becomes not just an economic tool, but a mirror of inequality. And still the system evolves. Central banks now speak of digital currencies, money that can be programmed, traced, and controlled line by line of code. Loans could be approved or canceled automatically. Interest could adjust in real time. Efficiency, they call it. But history whispers another word: control. From clay tablets to blockchain, the pattern remains. Debt enriches the lender, disciplines the borrower, and rewrites the meaning of freedom. The brilliance of the system is its invisibility. We celebrate it as growth, applaud it as opportunity, and rarely see the chains beneath. It requires no armies, no conquest, only confidence. As long as people believe tomorrow will pay for today, the machine hums on. But every machine built on promises must one day face the moment when promises run out. What happens then is not yet written. Perhaps the lesson is simple. Real wealth is not the ability to borrow endlessly, but the freedom to live without owing. Every era thinks it has mastered debt. Every era discovers it has only been mastered by it. History does not repeat, but it rhymes in interest. From the clay of Mesopotamia to the screens of Wall Street, the echo endures. The most profitable product ever invented was never a thing. It was a promise, and the world is still paying for it,